Everyone. So today we are continuing with Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, and we're looking at chapters 3 through 5, so 3, 4, and 5. And in these chapters, Freud sort of leaves behind the theme of religion and the question of the origin of religion, and takes up what is really his main concern in the book, which is connected to the theme of religion, which is the question of the origin of civilization, in essence. Where does civilization come from? Why is there civilization? What are the driving forces behind civilization? I suppose his real overarching question is about happiness, right? We saw that in chapters 1 and 2, and in chapter 3 he begins again our inquiry concerning happiness has not so far taught us much that is not already common knowledge. And so in investigating the origin of civilization, in trying to understand civilization, he is also asking about happiness, how we can be how we can be happy, and also the reasons why we're unhappy. And so he has already given us the main causes of our unhappiness, and he reiterates these here. Right? We've given the answer already by pointing to the three sources from which our suffering comes. So the three main sources of suffering, according to Freud, are the superior power of nature. Second, the feebleness of our own bodies. And thirdly, as he says here on page 57, the inadequacy of the regulations which adjust the mutual relationships of human beings in the family, the state, and society. So the three sources of our unhappiness, according to Freud, are nature, right, the external world, which is going to deny us things, right? Life is difficult because nature makes it hard to feed ourselves, hard to find shelter, right? The accidents of nature, etc. Also, our bodies, right? The feebleness of our own bodies, the fact that our bodies are constantly deteriorating, getting sick, limiting us in one way or another. These are the two sort of original, you might say, obstacles that any living organism faces, sources of frustration for any living thing. The main one, however, according to Freud, is this third one, the inadequacy of the regulations which adjust the mutual relationships of human beings. Right? In chapter 1, or maybe it was chapter 2, Freud describes this as the difficulty of other people, right? That other people are a source of frustration and unhappiness in our lives. And so this other people is now going to be analyzed as society, as civilization. So Freud thinks these first two sources of suffering we're pretty able to accept. And these first sources don't give us that much trouble. Right? We accept the limits of nature and our bodies, and right, as he'll go on to say, a lot of civilization is about overcoming those, and those can, in certain ways, be overcome. Nature can be controlled through technology, and even our own bodies through medicine, science, other forms of technology. Also, the deterioration of our bodies can be slowed and avoided to some extent. We're also just able to accept these and live with them, right? These are conditions of life. Every animal has to deal with nature and their deteriorating body. It's really the third source, right? The social source of suffering that makes us suffer and makes us the most unhappy, right? He says on page 58, we do not admit it at all, right? This source of social suffering. We don't admit that we suffer because of society. We cannot see why the regulations made by ourselves should not, on the contrary, be a protection and a benefit for every one of us. So, right, we are less willing to accept that society makes us unhappy. And so this is sort of, I think, at the center of what Freud is interested in here. Is it possible to eradicate suffering as a result of society? Is it possible to find a society, construct a society that would not be the source of suffering, right? We sort of understand this to be the goal of civilization, right? To remove suffering. And so we don't like to admit that society is one of the reasons that we suffer. This is according to Freud. Now, maybe why we don't admit this, or one of the reasons why we're reluctant to admit that we suffer because of society, is that we understand society not just as something that is supposed to remove suffering, but also we think of society as being driven toward, progressing toward some condition where as much suffering as possibly can be removed will be removed, right? Progress, the idea of technological innovation, of social justice, everything that is included in any concept of progress implies this idea that we're headed to a world that is going to have the least amount of suffering possible. So when it appears that those very same processes, those very same mechanisms of progress, technology, various social justice movements, right, when those produce suffering, it is a problem, right? Because those are supposed to only remove suffering. So one of the things that I think Freud is asking here is it possible to ever achieve this kind of sort of utopian society where there's as little suffering as possible? Or is suffering an inherent part of society and civilization, right? Does civilization cause pain and unhappiness inherently, right? Perhaps there's no way around this, right? And the idea that civilization is just about removing suffering, or is aimed at a world without suffering, might be a mistake, right? There might be suffering inherent in civilization that no amount of social organization, no amount of social justice or technological development is going to get rid of. So let's see. When we start considering this possibility, we come upon a contention which is so astonishing that we must dwell upon it. Right? This contention holds that what we call our civilization is largely responsible for our misery. Right? And that we should be much happier if we gave it up and returned to primitive conditions. So this is also interesting, right? This is considering the reverse of this idea. Not that civilization makes us happy, but precisely, yes, it is civilization that makes us unhappy. And therefore, the solution is to escape civilization, right? Even maybe to destroy civilization. So, I think this is a very interesting observation. And I think now is maybe the time to mention the time frame here. And so this book was published in 1930. And during this time period, Freud, who is living in Austria, is observing the rise of the Nazis in Germany and Austria. Right? Austria was full of Nazis, just like southern Germany, which it borders. So, right, Hitler doesn't come to power until 1933, but there's a long lead up before that moment where Nazi sentiment, the Nazi Party is building. And one of the sort of ideas of Nazism is the thought that, right, industrial society has produced all this misery, right? And, a lot of the sort of contemporary German mores, which were considered civilized, for example, tolerating homosexuality, tolerating a Jewish community, religious freedom, that sort of thing, right, was viewed as civilization, right? And one of the sources of misery of civilization. Right? Civilization makes us miserable because it forces us to, right, live among these people that we don't want to live with. Right? We're being told that we have to make space for homosexuals in Berlin, for Jews across Germany, and so that the Nazis viewed as one of the ills of civilization, and this is sort of the similar clash that we have in the United States these days, right? That on the one hand, one group thinks, for example, it is the civilized thing to do to accept refugees, to accept immigrants from around the world. And another group thinks, right, if that's civilization, then I would prefer barbarism, right? I would prefer to not be civilized. And so, the Germans, the Nazis, but also, we see this in the United States today. There was a sort of sense of, well, how do we escape civilization? How do we escape these miseries of civilization? Right, the social justice of civilization, etc. Well, we need to return to some pre-civilized kind of culture that existed prior to or might exist outside of civilization. And so for the Germans, that was a return to this Blut and Boden politics, right? Blood and soil. You return to a kind of tribalism, a sort of archaic and primal connection between a people and a land, and obviously that people would be determined according to genetics, to blood, to genes, etc. And so that would be a kind of pre-civilizational understanding of culture, right? And Hitler viewed himself as being like the Norse god Woden or Odin. And so it was this sort of return to a primal form of culture, which would have been sort of outside of civilization. It would have been embraced the barbaric as a preferable alternative to the civilized, because the civilized is imposing all these rules and expectations on us that make us unhappy. And so we can see sort of a similar kind of thinking in the United States with the political ideology of libertarianism, right? Libertarianism is a kind of, not to say libertarians are Nazis, that is a bridge too far, certainly. But the libertarian ideal is to escape civilization and society as much as possible. Right? I want to be as independent as I possibly can. I resent government that does anything besides, I don't even know what libertarians want government to do. I suppose, there's the sort of Ron Swanson joke from Parks and Rec. The only thing the government should do is the government should be one person who decides who to nuke, and that's it, right? And that is sort of, that's a joke version of it, but that is roughly the idea, right? The government is there for national security and nothing else. And that idea is, we need to, all these connections between us that keep us bound together, right? The sort of fabric of society is oppressive. And I want to escape it. And I will, build my own roads, find my own healthcare, whatever it might be. So what Freud is mentioning here on page 58 at the bottom is this alternative attitude, right, which doesn't think that civilization is a sort of utopian project or even, improves our lives. Instead, civilization is the source of our misery, right? And if we can, we should, as he says here, return to primitive conditions. Go out, live in nature, catch your own food, build your own house, and do everything on your own. So Freud asks, how has it happened that so many people have come to take up this strange attitude of hostility to civilization? He says, I believe that the basis of it was a deep and long-standing dissatisfaction with the then existing state of civilization, and that on that basis, a condemnation of it was built up, occasioned by certain specific historical events. Now, this is interesting, right? He's telling a kind of story about how this dissatisfaction, kind of resentment of civilization builds up. And, right, one possibility he will entertain is, well, civilization just creates a certain amount of suffering and unhappiness inherently. But he thinks there's also a sort of specific chain of events that has led to our current dissatisfaction. And we could certainly say the same thing about, the United States in the second decade of the 21st century. There are reasons why specific historical events that have led to the dissatisfaction with civilization. So he says, the first one of these he names goes back quite far, not in the history of humanity entirely. And when he's thinking about these sort of origins of civilization, he's thinking much further back. But he mentions as the first event in this chain of historical events that led to this moment of dissatisfaction, he mentions the victory of Christendom over the heathen religions, right? For it was very closely related to the low estimation put upon earthly life by the Christian doctrine. So he thinks, I think this is interesting, right, that one of the important moments that leads to this dissatisfaction is the rise of Christianity, the embrace of Christianity by the Roman Empire, right, which made Christianity the official religion of Rome, and that was then adopted throughout Europe and the Byzantine Empire. And the problem there, right, the reason that this leads to dissatisfaction is the low estimation put upon earthly life, right? So we can think back again also to Arendt here, I think, and her concept of freedom and the way Christianity, makes us think about freedom. When we stop being engaged with the physical world, when we stop believing the material world is what matters, and we direct our attention and energy to this non-material world, this transcendental realm of God, or the forms, or anything like that, then, right, we are not going to take care of our material conditions. We are going to be less likely to be invested in them, and we're more likely to allow for physical suffering within the material world, because that's not the world that really matters. Right? The world that really matters is the other world, the realm of the soul, the realm of God, the otherworldly realm. And so by investing ourselves in the otherworldly realm, we perhaps allow things to sort of go to pot in the physical realm. Now, Freud doesn't spell all that out, but we can think back to our Arendt and fill in some of the gaps there. This idea that we, I think both Freud and Arendt would agree, happiness comes not through, sort of suppressing some inner desire, and in choosing a righteous life over a sinful life. Happiness comes through the exercising of will, of energy, of allowing yourself to be that surging thing that we are, right? To use that Sartrean language of the human being as kind of surging energy. Freud will certainly agree that we get satisfaction, we get happiness only when we're allowed to expend that energy, when we allow ourselves to surge, to act in the physical world, right? To be and to be free for action. And so, anything that persuades us not to act, or that advises us that the inner life is really how we find happy, Freud will certainly agree that is a formula for repression, for frustration, and for a kind of build-up of energies, a build-up of desires that is, needs to have some kind of outlet, needs to be released and channeled somehow. And if it isn't channeled in some productive way through art or science or religion, then it's going to explode in some ugly and bad way. And this is, I think, another way to sort of understand Nazism and fascism, right? That this goes hand in hand with, sort of choosing, quote unquote, barbarism over, quote unquote, civilization. That by choosing barbarism, by choosing to reject that which is called civilization, one also is given permission then to release all of that pent-up, repressed, frustrated energy, right? And it's going to be released however you want. Right? There is no longer any taboo, any regulation. But so the next moment that he mentions here, and I think this is very interesting, the next moment that makes us resent civilization, he says, the last but one of these occasions was when the progress of voyages of discovery led to contact with primitive peoples and races. In consequence of insufficient observation and a mistaken view of their manners and customs, they appeared to Europeans to be leading a simple, happy life with few wants, a life such as was unattainable by their visitors with their superior civilization. And so Freud thinks we become dissatisfied with civilization also when we first encounter, we meaning Europeans, forgive the exclusive we there, when Europeans first encounter these quote unquote primitive peoples, when the Spanish first encounter the Aztecs, right, or the Inca, or when the Belgians encounter the Congolese, right? These cultures that had never before been exposed to European technology, cultures that had developed independently of European culture. Now, this is a tangent, but it is and it isn't. I think it's interesting when we're thinking about civilization to think about, what constitutes a culture. really. And we'll have opportunity to talk about that more in a minute. But to some extent, certainly, the culture of, well, the example of South American cultures is a better one because there is the sort of separation between European culture and, let's say, Aztec culture is certainly more complete than the separation between Congolese culture and Spanish culture, let's say. Still quite separate. But the point is here, right? A quote-unquote civilized society, and what we mean by civilized here is more or less, it seems, degree of technological development. And attending technological development would be degree of scientific and mathematical knowledge. When this civilized culture encounters this uncivilized culture, we get this moment of envy on the part of the civilized, right? And we imagine, right, the Europeans imagined, Freud thinks, that life would have been better in one of those primitive cultures. Now, Freud thinks this is not true, right? This is a mistaken view based on insufficient observation. And his reasons for this are, we imagine only the good parts of that life. We don't imagine the bad parts, right? We don't imagine the lack of modern medicine. We don't imagine the difficulty of finding food, etc. We sort of look at that, sort of pre-industrial culture, and we think, how easy they must have it, right? They don't have the pressures of a 9-to-5 job. They don't have taxes to pay. They don't have, bills to pay, etc. They don't have cars to keep running or whatever it might be. And so we associate these primitive cultures, quote unquote, roughly with something like the Garden of Eden. And so we say, the original condition, life must be better there. I think Freud rightly thinks that this is a kind of fantasy version of that life, and we're inclined to see that life as sort of fantastic because, among other things, we have this association with the Garden of Eden and that kind of lifestyle, right? Pre-civilizational lifestyle. But in any case, Freud then goes on to talk about what are really the things that cause us unhappiness in civilization, within society. Right? He says, the last occasion is especially familiar to us. It arose when people came to know about the mechanism of neuroses, which threatened to undermine the modicum of happiness enjoyed by civilized man. It was discovered that a person becomes neurotic because he cannot tolerate the amount of frustration which society imposes on him in the service of its cultural ideals. And it was inferred from this that the abolition or reduction of those demands would result in a return to possibilities of happiness. So, what makes us think that we would be happier outside of civilization is the discovery of neuroses, right? So, who discovered neuroses? More or less Freud, right? Roughly Freud discovered neuroses. Now, the idea of neuroses was around before Freud, but he certainly makes them widely popular. And psychoanalysis sort of begins as a treatment for neuroses. So Freud makes his name on neuroses, and he's sort of saying, when we become aware of how neuroses work, when we understand psychoanalysis, we then discover that what causes neuroses is the pressure of civilization, the pressure of cultural ideals, right? What makes us neurotic is our inability to deal with the frustrations of living in a society that puts demands on us. The reason why society makes us unhappy is because society demands things of us. Right? Obviously. So society demands things of us, right? Why does it do this? It is this question of cultural ideals, right? And this is an interesting point. So, what's interesting about it is the way Freud thinks about ideals in general. We remember from the last video uh, the way that the superego is formed for Freud. The other name for the superego is the ego ideal. Uh, and so the superego is an unconscious force within our psyche that is the internalization of our father, Freud thinks, right? That father is reified, is turned into an ideal, which is to say, a kind of perfect being. The father gets everything that we want as babies, as children, right? The father has the mother. The father is the provider. The father says when to go to bed. The father says what to eat. The father says what we're doing. The father says go to school, etc. Right? The father imposes this law in our lives and becomes this figure of sort of ultimate power and control. In order to deal with the father's law, right? Wake up at this time, eat this, go to school, do X, Y, Z, right? In order to deal with that law, we have to internalize it. We have to bring this father inside of ourselves and control ourselves if we're going to get any happiness out of following these rules, right? We have to make these rules our own in order to be happy about them, in order to live with them, to cope with them. So as long as it's the father telling me to wake up at 7 in the morning, I am oppressed. I am unhappy. I'm being told what to do. The way that we cope with this is we internalize that rule and we say, no longer is the father going to tell me to wake up at 7 in the morning. Now I am going to tell myself to wake up at 7 in the morning. No longer am I controlled by the father. I'm now controlled by myself. I want to wake up at 7 in the morning. And Freud thinks this is a normal, healthy period of development, moment in development. This is what everyone goes through. We have to go through this, right? We internalize these rules. We make them our own. And then this force that tells us to wake up at 7 in the morning becomes this permanent fixture in our psyche, this ego ideal. And it is that ego ideal, this internalization of the father, that functions more or less as our conscience, right? So when I don't wake up, when I skip school, when I spoil my dinner or whatever it is, that little voice that kicks in and says, you shouldn't have done that, right? Bad boy. Right? That is the ego ideal. Now, as we saw, right, this ego ideal, the superego, which is already a replacement for the father, when the child becomes an adult, that ego ideal needs some further backing up. right? Now that the father isn't there to enforce that ego ideal, I need some other enforcer in order to keep believing in it, right? Why do I listen to my superego? Where does this superego come from? What is the source of this ideal that I strive for? And why do I believe in it? And right, this is where we get the establishment of religion. Right? God is the replacement for the Father. So I internalize the Father, and then I externalize the Father again as this God. Now, the God or gods, any God, according to Freud, is the source of this cultural ideal. And so, these cultural ideals come from things like religion. They would also come from politics, from the state. Now Freud doesn't mention this, but we could also think of the king as a kind of externalization of the superego, right? A father kind of figure. Whatever the king says serves as a cultural ideal. These cultural ideals could also come from science, maybe particularly political science, or from philosophy, or from art, right? Ideas of beauty, Freud talks about, right? But in any case, these cultural ideals are projections from our superego. They operate like religious ideals. In this sense, they're kind of transcendental, and they are imposed on us. We feel pressure to live up to them. So these cultural ideals are what make us miserable, and when we are unable to live up to these cultural ideals, that's when we become neurotic, when we start to suffer, and the inability to live up to these cultural ideals is right what will lead us to abandon civilization and to choose to be uncivilized or to desire an escape from civilization. So we could think about this, I think, in U.S. culture. We could think about the expectations for an individual, and then how difficult it is to actually meet those expectations. And so, everyone grows up thinking, well, the way to become an adult is you get married, have kids, buy a house, get a salaried job that gives you health insurance. Not in that order, right? Actually, probably get a salaried job that provides health insurance, get married, buy a house, have kids. Now, there are so many reasons why achieving that is difficult and becoming increasingly difficult. Right? The inability to achieve that leads to frustration, leads to that frustration then expresses itself as maybe depression, maybe aggression, some form of neuroses that is going to take an unhealthy and dangerous form. And so I think in particular, this is often cited, right? The difficulty of achieving this ideal life is one of the reasons, especially for male dissatisfaction and these disaffected young men, right, that are all over the United States these days. Hmm. So, cultural ideals are one of the main sources of our frustration and unhappiness. Uh, and Freud then switches to another question. These chapters he kind of bounces around, but he asks next whether or not, he sort of returns to this question of, can this kind of phenomenon uh, ever be avoided? Right? Is it possible to have a culture that is not going to result in this kind of frustration that will lead to depression or aggression? And he now asks this question as a question of whether or not technology actually provides us with any kind of real happiness. Um, he asks essentially what the point of all this technology and industrial progress is. Does technology actually make us happy? And Freud thinks, in essence, no. Right? Technology provides us with superficial pleasures, what he calls cheap enjoyment, on page 61. Technology doesn't make us happy. It seems, if anything, to just provide more sources of frustration. So, whatever is wrong with culture, whatever is wrong with civilization, whatever makes us miserable, can't be solved through technology, Freud thinks. And it's not going to be industry, innovation, invention, anything like that that is going to make us happier. Right? However, this doesn't mean that less technology would make us happier either. Right? Uh, Technology is not what makes us happy or unhappy. What makes us happy or unhappy in civilization is that question again of the regulation of our relations with other people. What are we allowed to do and what are we not? What are the things that society allows us to do and what are the things that we are not allowed to do? So he says, in describing civilization, he says, we shall therefore content ourselves with saying once more that the word civilization describes the whole sum of the achievements and the regulations which distinguish our lives from those of our animal ancestors, and which serves two purposes, right? Namely, to protect men against nature and to adjust their mutual relations. And so, technology, science, all of that is only useful for protecting us against nature. But protection against nature is not what really makes us miserable. What makes us miserable is our mutual relations with other people. So there's some interesting stuff here. The second half of, or in chapter 3, about how these mutual relations work and sort of why culture is breaking down. So let's just talk about this a little bit. What he says on page 66, or beginning on 65. Thinking about tools and technology, he writes, Long ago, he, man, formed an ideal conception of omnipotence and omniscience, which he embodied in his gods. To these gods, he attributed everything that seemed unattainable to his wishes or that was forbidden to him. One may say, therefore, that these gods were cultural ideals. This is on 66. Today, he has come very close to the attainment of this ideal. He has almost become a god himself. Only, it is true, in the fashion in which ideals are usually attained according to the general judgment of humanity, not completely, in some respects not at all, in others halfway, man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. So, one of the sort of problems with where we're at in civilization in the 20th century, in 1930, is that through industrial and technological development, we have ourselves attained many of the powers that we formerly attributed to gods, right? We've expanded our knowledge and our powers, right, to enormous extents. Traveled the globe in a day. I can speak to someone on the other side of the globe instantaneously. Right, through all of this technology, we can look deep into space, we can look at atoms, all of that. Right, and so in terms of our power and our knowledge, we've become godlike. So civilization has, to a great extent, indeed conquered nature, right? We, the pandemic notwithstanding, no longer fear disease in the same way that we would have 500 years ago. We aren't afraid of wild animals. We aren't afraid of storms. Right? To a large extent, human civilization has completely sheltered us from nature. But what's more than that, right, is that by becoming so powerful, we have also in a way, surpassed the cultural ideal of the past. Right? By becoming godlike, we have destroyed certain cultural ideals. If we ourselves are like gods, then that is no longer a useful cultural ideal. Right? We need some other cultural ideal, some other thing to strive for. And so one of the other functions of society or civilization, which maybe fills in here, is the creation of non-practical or even non-useful things. Right? Technology is useful. Tools are useful towards some end. But civilization is also about beauty. And in addition to beauty, it's also about order. So on page 67, 68, 69, Freud is talking about these sorts of ideals that civilization sets up. Not about power or control of nature or our bodies, but about beauty, order, and he also says cleanliness. And so the cultural ideals that remain after sort of this moment of cultural technological dominance are ideals of orderliness, cleanliness, and beauty. So Freud here mentions, gives a kind of allusion to the history of civilization. The history of civilization is indeed guided by an idea of order. Freud mentions that our first idea of order, or maybe not our first, but one of the original concepts of order comes from astronomy, right? And the order of the movement of the heavenly bodies, of the planets, right? Astronomy observes that not only does the sun move regularly and orderly, the moon, right, moves regularly and orderly, and so do the stars. And so all of the stars have a regular motion that can be observed. Civilization is then disciplining ourselves to have a similar degree of orderliness. Civilization is imposing order on ourselves, trying to emulate the stars. There's a lot more that can be said about this, right? Astronomy is a key discipline in Plato's Republic. Plato explicitly ties his education of the philosopher and his ideal city, his kind of utopian political order, to the idea of astronomy and to the mathematical studies that are, constitute astronomy. So Freud is making reference to this book 7 of Plato's Republic, where he's making this connection between how we become civilized through education, how we become civilized as a state and a political body, and the orderliness that we find in the sciences and in astronomy in particular. It's interesting. In any case, right, order is the ultimate ideal then of a civilization beyond mere technological development. In order to create order, we have to have organization. We can order our own lives, but we have to also order the lives of those around us. I think in the next chapter, we'll talk more about why this drive to order requires social organization, not just individual organization, and not just individual ethics. On page 71, Freud writes, in any case, perhaps we may begin by explaining that the element of civilization enters on the scene with the first attempt to regulate social relationships. The reason why we need social order, the reason why we need to regulate social relationships is because those relationships will inevitably have an impact on my own life. I do not live completely independently. Other people affect me. So in order to organize my life, I have to enter into social arrangements that are themselves ordered. I need to organize my life in accord with the organization of a social group. And the reason for this, Freud says, it goes on page 71, if the attempt were not made to regulate social relationships, the relationships would be subject to the arbitrary will of the individual. That is to say, the physically stronger man would decide them in the sense of his own interests and instinctual impulses. If we don't have some social order, if we don't have civilization, then I am at the whim and will of anyone who's stronger than me, anyone who chooses to oppress me, right, to exert control over me. So Freud is telling a very old story here about the beginning of civilization. It's a story that you can read in Rousseau, among other places. Story of how civilization begins is, right, that originally people, even Plato tells this story, that originally people organized themselves in order to fight off strong individuals. A strong individual is able to take control over a weaker individual, but a band of weaker individuals is stronger than a single strong person. And so a group has to form an alliance and organize themselves to work against this strong individual. So civilization is first organized against the strong individual that wants to rule over them all, right? So the strong man wants to rule based on only his interest, right? Whatever I want, you'll do. That can only be fought by a group of people pursuing mutual interests. We all want to kill this strong man. It's not my own individual interest, it's in all of our interest. That's the beginning of society, right? So that is kind of organization, a kind of order, kind of law. Right? We're all against this guy. So Freud continues, nothing would be changed in this if the stronger man should in his turn meet someone even stronger than he. Human life in common is only made possible when a majority comes together which is stronger than any separate individual and which remains united against all separate individuals. Right? Civilization is then continued in the name of preventing any strong individual from coming to power, from becoming a tyrant. And so, I think this is a kind of fairy tale of how civilization begins. Sounds very much like The Social Contract. Sounds like a very modern story of the origin of civilization. But it's also kind of intuitive one, right? As I said, we find something similar in Plato. It tells a kind of different story, but the way Freud sees it is the replacement of the power of the individual by the power of a community constitutes the decisive step of civilization. The essence of it lies in the fact that the members of the community restrict themselves in their possibilities of satisfaction, whereas the individual knew no such restriction. The first requisite of civilization, therefore, is that of justice. So the group that fights against the individual is then based in this mutual interest, but also, Freud thinks, based in the belief that no individual should rule, right? So Freud thinks there's this kind of inherent democracy or republicanism in society, right? An inherent sense that no individual should have power over everyone. The essence of this community, however, or not however, but therefore, uh, is the fact that they restrict themselves from certain satisfactions. To belong to this community is to say, I will not seek as an individual to gain power over all of you. I deny myself that possibility of satisfaction. I would love to be king. I would love to rule over everyone. But I'm a part of a community in which that is forbidden, and therefore I will deny myself that satisfaction. I will restrict that urge. So Freud says the first requisite of civilization, therefore, is that of justice. Justice, interestingly, Freud thinks, is this denying yourself something in order to be a part of a community. Community is based on an idea of justice, and justice is about properly regulating yourself according to the demands of that community. Now, this is actually, I think, a very good way to think about justice. It acknowledges that justice is about my relation to other people, and that it is grounded in the expectations of a particular community. Moreover, it allows that what one community calls justice, some other community might not, and therefore explains how one group might view something as unjust and another as just, and how even one member of a group might bring a new idea of justice into that group. So Freud says on 72, this implies nothing as to the ethical value of such a law. What is called justice by a community is not guaranteed to be actually good or valuable. Right? It is just what is recognized as a necessary regulation by the community. However, Freud thinks, in the same way that civilization is a kind of constant expansion and development of technological power, it is also inherently bound up in the project of expanding its idea of law. That the goal of civilization is to find a rule for all people, for the whole world. Right? So the final outcome should be a rule of law to which all have contributed by a sacrifice of their instincts and which leaves no one at the mercy of brute force. Right? The goal is a global civilization that will be acceptable to all. Right? What are the regulations that all people can live with? And this is interesting, right? This is really language that comes straight out of the idea of the social contract. Everyone will sacrifice their instincts, right? Frustrate, restrict certain instincts and desires in order to get justice, right? Happiness from society, which is to say, to not be oppressed, not be abused, and to be free to pursue those satisfactions that are reasonable. Now, as I was just saying, right, this idea of justice is malleable, is relative to a community. The fact that there are certain ideas of justice in every community is not evidence that they aren't based in a community. Right? Um, you could say those are ideas that are inherent to the human community, something like that. However, sometimes ideas of justice, Freud thinks, can be too restrictive, can overregulate our instincts. And Freud thinks, right, this is one explanation for why someone might rebel against or want to leave civilization. Sometimes the demands of justice are too stringent, can be oppressive, right? If, for example, we say, I am not going to buy anything that is produced outside of the United States or that is made with unfair labor practices, right? Let's say that is my rule. Maybe that's the rule of my community. That's going to make life very difficult, right? It's going to make life also expensive. So you can imagine, right, that, all right, well, maybe that's an idea of justice that works for certain communities, but if that idea of justice were extended to a larger group, it might become oppressive. Right? You're telling me I can't buy clothes from the Gap, right? That I can't eat McDonald's, that I can't, pretty much buy anything. There was just a New York Times article about, well, I can't remember the details of it, but of, the acceptance on the part of enormous American corporations of really atrocious labor conditions in around the world, right? So you can imagine why that sort of thing might be oppressive, too stringent. And then people will say, right, that they want freedom from civilization. So freedom comes to be put in opposition to justice when ideas of justice are too regulatory, too powerful, too stringent. So, right, I think that's an interesting thing to think about, right? That we sometimes think, well, there is justice and there's injustice, and you either do justice or you do injustice. Well, no, I think Freud is rightly pointing out here, right? We agree as a community what is just and unjust, what we're willing to tolerate and not willing to tolerate. And what is tolerable for some people is not going to be tolerable for other people. And, what politics is negotiating as a community, as a large collective, which injustices we are not willing to tolerate and will be made illegal. Right? So, I'm not saying that, right, we shouldn't care, or it's our right to not care about, child labor or, horrible working conditions or low pay around the world. Rather, if you do care, then you have to persuade people that they should also care, right? That they should regulate themselves to stop supporting that. But in any case, right, Freud thinks there are certain cases in which freedom is put in opposition to justice because justice is too strict. Conception of justice is too strict. But he thinks there are also cases in which freedom is put in opposition to justice because an individual wants to reclaim some of those instincts that society has rightfully prohibited. Right? So, for example, there was a relatively well-known and prominent group in the 20th century, the name of which is escaping me, that promoted pederasty, right? Promoted sexual relationships between adults and children, particularly adults and teenage boys. In certain communities, certain social circles in the 20th century, that was acceptable, right? That was all right. And the social prohibition on that kind of relationship was viewed as unjust, right? Overly prohibitive, overly strict. And right, the call was for freedom. We want the freedom to have these kinds of relationships. Society is oppressing us by not allowing us to have these kinds of relationships. And that was viewed by some people, even in mainstream politics and life, as a legitimate argument. And today, that is sort of unimaginable. Why did I mention that? I don't know. I guess now to make a juxtaposition, right? We could imagine an individual today saying, right, I want to have a relationship, a sexual relationship with a young boy, right? I don't think that it is necessarily wrong to prohibit that kind of relationship, but I want to do it. And anyone that prohibits me from doing what I want to do is committing an injustice, right? Is wrong, right? That government should never tell us what to do. No one should ever be able to tell us what to do. I'll do what I want to do. I will follow my instincts. I will satisfy any urge that I have, right? And any kind of prohibition on that is tyranny, right? We see this all the time today. Not to equate this to that, but right. I mean, you're telling me to wear a mask. That's tyranny, right? So anyone telling you anything can be perceived as tyranny, but that attitude is, Freud thinks, the attitude not of someone who is concerned about society, thinks that society has too prohibitive an idea of justice, but is someone who is concerned about themselves as individuals, right? I want to do what I want to do, not I don't think this is something that we should all do or all not do. Now, the conflict between individual and society is at the heart of our misery, Freud thinks. Right? The reason why we struggle primarily is because of the relation between our interests as an individual and the interests of society. And those interests of the individual get extended to the interests of the group, of family, of friends. And when our family interests are in conflict with the interests of the state or society, that's when things get really messy, right? Because then I can be interested in a group, a collective, some ideal that is a social ideal, but it's going to be in conflict with another social ideal. So how do I navigate those two different ideals? All right, so we'll take a little break and we'll pick up with chapter 5 and 6.